Some men walk away when love becomes difficult, but Daniel Hayes chose to walk away when Emily Carter could barely stand. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and winter air drifting through a cracked window, and Emily sat upright in the narrow bed with a blanket around her shoulders, her body still weak, her hands trembling slightly, as if the world itself had tilted under her feet, while Daniel stood a few feet away in a charcoal suit that looked too sharp for a place filled with quiet suffering, holding a thin stack of papers like they weighed nothing at all. Divorce papers, neat and official, the kind that ended a life with a single signature. Outside, the late November sky hung low and gray over Chicago, the city lights beginning to glow as evening settled across the skyline. But inside that small hospital room the air felt frozen in time, because Emily was still trying to understand how everything had collapsed in less than 24 hours. Just the day before she had believed they were waiting for a future together, a home filled with laughter, the soft footsteps of a child running through hallways, the simple promise of family, and now the silence pressed against her ears like a heavy curtain. Daniel cleared his throat as if he were about to present a business proposal instead of dismantling a marriage. His voice carried the cool patience of a man who had already made his decision miles before arriving here. "Emily," he said, "I think we both know this isn't working anymore." The words fell between them with a strange calm, as though he were discussing a lease agreement or a car payment instead of the life they had built together for 6 years. Emily looked at him carefully, studying the familiar angles of his face, the same blue eyes that had once convinced her she was the luckiest woman in the world. But tonight they looked distant, like a door already closed. Her fingers tightened around the hospital sheet. "You're leaving now?" she asked quietly. Daniel didn't answer right away. He set the papers on the small rolling tray beside her bed and slid a pen forward. "I think it's better for both of us if we move on," he said, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "My career is taking off, Emily. Investors, travel, the firm expanding. To the West Coast. I can't carry this." His hand gestured vaguely toward the bed, toward her exhaustion, toward the quiet grief that had hollowed out the room. Emily followed the movement of his hand, and for a moment something inside her chest cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet fracture that felt final. Earlier that morning a doctor had spoken gently about complications and recovery, about rest and healing, about time, but Daniel Hayes had clearly decided he didn't believe in waiting. The pen lay on the tray like a challenge. Emily stared at it for several seconds, her heartbeat slow and heavy, the silence between them stretching longer than a mile of empty highway. Somewhere down the hallway a nurse laughed softly with a colleague, the sound drifting in like it belonged to another world. Finally Emily picked up the pen. Her hand shook slightly, but her voice did not. "If this is what you want," she said. Daniel exhaled, as if relieved the conversation was ending. "It's the right decision," he replied, already stepping back, already halfway out of the life they once shared. Emily signed her name slowly across the bottom of the page, each letter feeling like the closing of a door. Daniel gathered the papers, glanced at the signature, and nodded once with quiet satisfaction. "Take care of yourself, Emily," he said, the same way someone might say goodbye after a short meeting. Then he turned and walked out of the hospital room without looking back. The door clicked softly behind him, and the silence returned. Emily sat very still for a long moment, listening to the faint hum of the building around her, her palm drifting unconsciously to rest against her stomach as a thought flickered quietly through her mind, a truth Daniel Hayes would never hear tonight, the truth that she wasn't leaving that hospital alone. The night Daniel Hayes walked out of that hospital room, Chicago felt colder than it ever had before, the wind sweeping through the downtown streets like winter had decided to arrive early, and Emily Carter sat alone beside the narrow hospital window watching the distant headlights glide along Lakeshore Drive, while a quiet realization settled deep inside her chest, the kind that changes a life without making a sound. The divorce papers were gone, Daniel was gone, and the future she once imagined had vanished with the soft click of a door, yet beneath the exhaustion in her bones there was something else now, a fragile awareness that she was not entirely alone. A week later, Emily left the hospital carrying a single duffel bag and a stack of discharge papers, the skyline fading behind the taxi window as she crossed the bridge out of downtown Chicago, And for the first time since the world had collapsed, she allowed herself to breathe slowly and place her hand over her stomach again, the small gesture steady and protective. Daniel Hayes believed he had ended a marriage that night, but Emily was quietly stepping into a different kind of future, one he would never be part of. The months that followed were not glamorous or easy. Emily moved into a modest apartment on the north side of Seattle, a place above a small bakery where the smell of fresh bread drifted through the hallway every morning at 6 o'clock. The apartment was barely 700 square feet, with creaking floors and a narrow kitchen window that overlooked a rainy street lined with maple trees, but it was quiet and it was hers. She found work cataloging books in a local library, the kind of peaceful job that allowed long hours of quiet thought and the gentle rhythm of turning pages. The librarians learned quickly that Emily Carter was dependable, thoughtful, and calm, the sort of person who spoke softly but carried an unusual steadiness in her voice. What they did not know was that every evening she walked home beneath the dim streetlights carrying something far more important than a paycheck, the silent promise of 3 new heartbeats growing stronger with every passing week. Emily never spoke Daniel Hayes' name again. She did not search for news about his rising career or the investment firm that continued expanding across the country. Instead, she focused on small things, warm soup on cold evenings, prenatal checkups that reassured her the babies were healthy, and quiet moments where she imagined the kind of mother she wanted to become. Then one rainy afternoon in early spring, when the clouds hung low over Seattle and traffic crawled along the wet streets, Emily's life shifted again in a way she could not have predicted. She had just left the library carrying a stack of donated books when a sudden commotion unfolded. Near the corner of Pine Street, a dark sedan pulled over beside the sidewalk and a tall man stepped out looking disoriented, his expensive coat soaked by the steady drizzle as if he had been walking for miles without noticing the weather. Emily hesitated for only a moment before approaching him, concern outweighing caution. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked gently. The man looked up, surprise crossing his features as though he was not used to strangers speaking to him so directly. His name, though Emily did not know it yet, was Alexander Reed, and the quiet kindness of a woman carrying 3 unborn children was about to change the direction of both their lives. Alexander Reed did not look like a man who needed help, yet the moment he leaned slightly against the rain-slicked car door, Emily could see the faint exhaustion behind his calm expression, the kind that hides beneath expensive coats and quiet confidence, and she instinctively shifted the stack of books in her arms while studying him with gentle concern. "You look like you have been walking in the rain for a while," she said softly. The man gave a faint smile, the sort of polite expression someone uses when they are used to solving their own problems. "It has been a long day," he replied, his voice deep but steady. His driver stepped out of the sedan a second later looking apologetic and slightly flustered, explaining that there had been a brief delay while the car was inspected after a warning light appeared, but the situation was already under control. Emily nodded and began to step away, assuming the moment had passed, yet Alexander Reed watched her for a second longer than expected. There was something unusual about the woman standing on that rainy Seattle sidewalk, something quiet but strong in the way she held herself, the way her hand rested protectively against her coat, without her even noticing. "Thank you for asking if I was all right," he said as she turned to leave. "Most people walk past without noticing anything." Emily smiled politely, brushing a strand of damp hair away from her face. "Everyone deserves someone to notice," she answered before continuing toward the apartment building down the street. Alexander Reed stood there for a moment watching her disappear into the soft gray drizzle, a thoughtful expression crossing his face before he stepped back into the waiting sedan. Their paths might have ended there if life followed predictable patterns, but sometimes the quietest encounters echo the longest. 2 weeks later, Emily returned to the same street corner after work carrying groceries, moving slowly beneath the weight of the rain and the growing life she carried, when a familiar voice greeted her from across the sidewalk. "Miss Carter," Alexander Reed said, stepping out of the same dark sedan with a composed smile that suggested he rarely forgot a face. Emily blinked in surprise. "I did not expect to see you again," she admitted. Alexander gestured lightly toward the nearby coffee shop, where warm light glowed through fogged windows. "I realized I never properly thanked you for your kindness that afternoon," he said. "May I buy you a cup of coffee?" Emily hesitated for a moment before agreeing, mostly because the smell of fresh roasted beans drifting from the cafe felt welcoming after a long day. Inside, the quiet hum of conversation and soft jazz filled the air while rain tapped gently against the glass. Alexander listened more than he spoke, learning small pieces of Emily's story. Without pushing for details, she clearly preferred to keep private. He noticed the thoughtful way she chose her words, the calm strength beneath her soft voice, and the quiet determination that seemed to follow her like a steady rhythm. Emily learned that Alexander Reed led a technology company known for clean energy research, a man whose name appeared occasionally in national headlines, yet who seemed strangely comfortable sitting at a small wooden cafe table on a rainy evening. Over the next few months their paths crossed again and again, sometimes by coincidence and sometimes because Alexander began choosing the same neighborhood routes when he visited Seattle. By the time autumn returned to the city, Emily Carter's life had changed in ways she never expected, because Alexander Reed had become more than a familiar stranger. He had become the one person who saw her not as someone broken by the past, but as someone quietly building a future. And when the day finally came that Emily brought 3 newborn children home beneath the soft autumn sunlight of Seattle, Alexander Reed stood beside her with the calm certainty of a man who had already decided those children were part of his world. The first winter with 3 newborn children arrived. Quietly in Seattle, bringing soft gray mornings, warm lamplight in small rooms, and the constant gentle rhythm of life beginning again. Emily Carter often stood near the apartment window before sunrise, watching the faint glow of streetlights reflect across the wet pavement, while 3 tiny cribs lined the wall behind her like a promise she had never imagined surviving long enough to see. Life had become a careful balance of sleepless nights, warm bottles of milk, soft lullabies, and the slow discovery that even the deepest heartbreak could give way to something steady and meaningful. Alexander Reed visited often during those early months, never arriving with loud gestures or dramatic declarations, but with quiet consistency that felt far more valuable. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes warm soup from a nearby restaurant, and sometimes he simply sat in the small living room holding one of the babies while Emily finally rested for an hour. The apartment that once felt narrow and uncertain slowly transformed into something warmer, a place where laughter replaced silence, and where the future no longer felt like an empty road. The 3 children grew quickly, each carrying their own tiny personality even before they could speak clearly. The first was Noah, calm and observant with bright blue eyes that studied everything around him. The second was Lily, curious and fearless, the kind of child who reached for the world before understanding it. The youngest was Ethan, quiet but determined, always gripping his mother's finger with surprising strength. Alexander seemed to understand instinctively how to move through their world without forcing himself into it. He never tried to replace anyone from Emily's past, never asked questions she was not ready to answer, and never pushed the fragile boundaries she had built around her heart. Instead, he simply became part of the rhythm of their lives. When Noah took his first steps across the living room floor, Alexander was there applauding softly beside Emily. When Lily learned to say her first clear word, it was Emily's name, and Alexander smiled like he had witnessed something extraordinary. When Ethan finally laughed for the first time, the sound filled the small apartment like sunlight breaking through clouds. Years passed quietly in that Seattle neighborhood, where rainy afternoons blended into golden autumn evenings, and long summer sunsets stretched across the sky until nearly 9 o'clock. Emily eventually left her job at the library and began helping manage a charitable literacy program Alexander's company supported, organizing book drives and reading events for children across the city. The work gave her a renewed sense of purpose, something deeper than survival. By the time Noah, Lily, and Ethan turned 6 years old, the small apartment above the bakery had been replaced by a peaceful home near the water where tall cedar trees surrounded a wide porch and the smell of salt air drifted in from Puget Sound. The children ran freely through the yard while Emily watched them with a calm smile that no longer carried the shadows of her past. One evening as the sun dipped low over the horizon, Alexander stood beside her on the porch holding 2 cups of tea. "You built something extraordinary here," he said quietly. Emily followed the sound of laughter echoing from the yard where the children chased each other through the grass. their voices bright and fearless. She did not answer right away because sometimes the strongest victories do not need words. Yet far away in another city, a man named Daniel Hayes continued building his own version of success, unaware that the life he once abandoned had quietly grown into something far greater than he ever imagined. Years moved forward with the quiet certainty of seasons changing along the Seattle shoreline, and the house near Puget Sound slowly filled with the small traditions that turn a place into a real home. On summer mornings, Emily Carter would open the wide kitchen windows and let the scent of salt air drift inside while Noah, Lily, and Ethan raced across the backyard, chasing each other through tall grass that glittered with dew. Their laughter echoed against the cedar trees, bright and fearless, the kind of laughter that comes from children who have never known a broken beginning. Alexander Reed often watched those moments from the porch with a thoughtful expression, coffee warming his hands while the early sunlight painted the water in soft gold. In the years since that rainy afternoon on Pine Street, the quiet connection between him and Emily had grown into something steady and undeniable. He admired the way she moved through life with calm determination, never boasting about the strength it had taken to rebuild everything from the ground up. Emily admired the quiet integrity in Alexander, a man whose influence reached across industries, yet who seemed most content kneeling in the grass, while Ethan tried to explain the complicated rules of a new game he had invented. The children adored him without hesitation. Noah followed him through the garage whenever Alexander worked on small weekend projects, asking endless questions about tools and engines. Lily insisted he attend every school reading event because she believed his applause was louder than anyone else's. Ethan simply climbed onto his lap during evening story time, as if it were the most natural place in the world. Over time, even the neighbors began to see the family as something unshakable, a peaceful presence along the quiet coastal road where bicycles leaned against fences and porch lights glowed warmly after sunset. Emily's Literacy Foundation continued expanding across Washington state, bringing mobile libraries and reading programs to small towns where children often had little access to books. Alexander supported the work quietly through his company's resources, but he always made it clear that the foundation belonged to Emily's vision, not his influence. One crisp autumn evening, nearly 8 years after the night that had changed everything in Chicago, Emily stood beside Alexander at the edge of the water, watching the sunset stretch across the sound like a ribbon of copper light. The children were skipping stones nearby, their silhouettes small against the horizon while gulls drifted above the waves. Life has a strange way of rewriting the future, Alexander said thoughtfully. Emily smiled faintly, remembering a hospital room that felt like the end of the world. Sometimes it just needs time, she answered softly. Far across the country in New York City, Daniel Hayes was standing beneath the glittering chandeliers of a Manhattan ballroom, where the air buzzed with quiet conversations about investments and new partnerships. His career had grown exactly the way he once predicted, with headlines praising his strategic instincts and financial influence. Yet tonight something unusual had drawn the attention of nearly every guest in the room. A major philanthropic announcement was about to be made, and the event host was welcoming a new foundation partner whose reputation had recently begun appearing in national news. Daniel adjusted his cufflinks absently while scanning the room, unaware that the next few minutes were about to reconnect him with a chapter of his past he believed had disappeared forever. The ballroom in Manhattan shimmered with polished marble floors, towering crystal chandeliers, and the quiet hum of conversations carried between investors, philanthropists, and executives who measured success in billion-dollar deals and global headlines. Daniel Hayes moved through the room with the ease of a man who had spent the last decade mastering environments exactly like this one. His tailored suit fit perfectly, his confident posture drew approving glances, and his reputation as a strategic investor had placed him firmly among the evening's most respected guests. Waiters moved gracefully between small circles of conversation, offering glasses of sparkling water and champagne, while a jazz trio played softly near the stage, creating the kind of atmosphere where power and prestige felt almost effortless. Daniel accepted a drink from a passing server and scanned the crowd with practiced attention. Nights like this were not only social gatherings, they were opportunities. Partnerships were born in quiet corners of rooms like this, and Daniel had built an entire career on recognizing moments before anyone else did. Tonight's event centered around a philanthropic expansion involving national education initiatives, a cause that had recently begun attracting major investors. A well-known host stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone gently, drawing the room into attentive silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining us this evening," he announced with a warm professional smile. "Tonight we are honored to welcome a new partner whose work in educational outreach has already transformed communities across the Pacific Northwest." Daniel lifted his glass slightly, listening with polite interest while his mind calculated potential opportunities connected to the announcement. The host continued speaking about literacy programs, mobile libraries, and new partnerships bringing books to children in underserved areas. The audience responded with approving murmurs. Daniel appreciated the initiative, but assumed it would simply involve another regional nonprofit seeking national exposure. Then the host added one more detail. "This program has been made possible through a collaboration between the Reed Foundation and its founder, Emily Carter Reed." The name drifted across the ballroom like a quiet ripple through still water. Daniel froze. For a brief moment, he wondered if he had misheard the introduction. The name Emily Carter echoed through a corner of his memory he had not visited in years, a memory tied to a hospital room in Chicago, a signature on a divorce paper, and a chapter of his life he believed had closed permanently. Reed Foundation, the host continued, has become one of the most effective literacy initiatives in the country, and tonight we are fortunate to welcome both its founder and her partner Alexander Reed. A few seconds later, the grand ballroom doors opened slowly at the back of the hall. Conversation stopped almost instantly as guests turned their heads toward the entrance. A tall man stepped inside first, composed and confident, his presence carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to influence without needing to announce it. Alexander Reed. Daniel recognized the name immediately. Reed Industries had grown into one of the most powerful clean energy companies in North America over the last decade. But it was the woman walking beside him that caused Daniel Hayes to feel the ground beneath his certainty shift in a way he had never experienced before. Emily Carter entered the room with calm grace, wearing a simple, deep blue evening dress that reflected the soft glow of the chandeliers above. Her posture was steady, her expression peaceful, and her presence seemed to quiet the entire room without effort. Daniel stared across the ballroom, unable to move, the years collapsing suddenly into a single moment as recognition settled in his chest like a shock of cold air. The woman he had once believed too fragile to keep up with his world was now standing at the center of a room filled with the most powerful people in the country, and beside her walked a billionaire whose name shaped global industries. For several seconds, Daniel Hayes could not hear anything except the sudden rush of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. The polished ballroom around him seemed to blur slightly as he stared across the crowd at the woman he once believed had vanished from his life forever. Emily Carter stood beside Alexander Reed with quiet confidence, greeting guests and shaking hands as though she had always belonged in rooms like this. There was no trace of the exhausted woman Daniel remembered from the hospital years ago. The fragile uncertainty he had once associated with her was gone. In its place was something calm, composed, and unmistakably powerful. Conversations resumed gradually throughout the ballroom as the host invited the new partners to the stage. Alexander walked forward first, offering a polite nod to several investors who greeted him with visible respect. Emily followed beside him with steady grace. Daniel found himself stepping closer through the crowd without even realizing it, drawn by a mixture of disbelief and something far more uncomfortable that he had not felt in years. Regret. On stage, the host smiled warmly. "Please join me in welcoming Alexander Reed and Emily Carter Reed, founders of the Reed Foundation." The room filled with applause as the two stepped beneath the bright chandelier lights. Alexander spoke briefly about the mission of expanding literacy programs to communities that had long been overlooked. His voice was measured and thoughtful, the tone of a man accustomed to leading large organizations while remaining grounded in purpose. Then he turned toward Emily and gestured gently for her to speak. The room grew quiet again. Emily stood at the podium for a moment, looking out across the audience filled with investors, journalists, and executives. Daniel could see her clearly now from only a few yards away. The years had changed her, but not in the way he once imagined. Her expression carried the quiet confidence of someone who had rebuilt an entire life piece by piece. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Emily began, her voice calm and warm. "Books changed my life when I needed hope the most. I wanted to make sure other children could find that same door to opportunity." Daniel felt the words settle into the air around him. There was no bitterness in her tone, no trace of accusation, only steady purpose. She spoke about small towns where children waited eagerly for the mobile library trucks to arrive, about volunteers reading stories in community centers, about the simple belief that every child deserved access to imagination and education. The applause that followed her speech was genuine and long. As Emily stepped down from the stage, several prominent guests moved forward to greet her and Alexander. Daniel remained frozen for another moment before finally setting his untouched glass on a nearby table. Something inside him insisted he needed to speak to her, to understand how the woman he had once dismissed had become the center of a movement admired by some of the most influential people in the country. He began walking slowly through the crowd toward her. Emily turned slightly while listening to another guest, and for the first time her eyes met Daniel's across the ballroom. Recognition passed through her expression in a quiet flicker. But instead of shock or anger, her reaction was something far more unexpected. Calm acknowledgement. As if the past standing in front of her was simply another chapter that had already been written and closed. Daniel Hayes stopped a few feet away from Emily Carter Reed, close enough now to see the quiet confidence in her posture and the calm clarity in her eyes. The music from the jazz trio drifted softly through the ballroom, but the world around him seemed strangely muted. For a moment neither of them spoke. The years between them hung silently in the air like a story that had already been written long ago. Emily was the first to break the silence with a polite, steady voice. "Hello, Daniel." Hearing his name spoken so calmly unsettled him more than anger would have. "Emily, I did not expect to see you here," he said slowly, trying to maintain the composed confidence he usually carried in professional rooms like this. Emily's expression remained warm but distant, the kind of smile people offer to acquaintances from a life that no longer belongs to them. "It has been a long time," she replied. Daniel searched her face, trying to find the woman he once believed he understood. But the Emily standing before him was entirely different. She carried herself with the quiet assurance of someone who had nothing left to prove. Before Daniel could say anything more, Alexander Reed stepped closer, his presence calm, yet unmistakably commanding. Emily turned slightly toward him. "Alexander, this is Daniel Hayes. We knew each other many years ago." Alexander extended his hand with a courteous nod. "I have heard your name in the investment world," he said in an even tone. Daniel shook his hand automatically, though his thoughts were racing. The billionaire's composure made it clear he was well aware of who Daniel was, and perhaps more importantly, who he had once been in Emily's life. Daniel glanced between them. "The Reed Foundation. It is impressive work," he admitted, his voice carrying a hint of uncertainty he rarely allowed others to hear. Emily gave a small appreciative nod. "Thank you. It means a lot to the communities we serve." For a moment the three of them stood together beneath the glow of the chandeliers, while guests continued to mingle nearby. Yet Daniel sensed there was something more to the story he did not understand. He looked toward Alexander again. "So you and Emily started this together?" Alexander's gaze shifted briefly toward Emily before answering. "We built it together over the years. It has been one of the most meaningful journeys of my life." The words were simple but carried unmistakable loyalty. Daniel felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. He had spent years believing he understood success, measuring it in numbers, partnerships, and influence. Yet standing here now he realized the life he once dismissed had grown into something far greater than any projection he could have calculated. Emily glanced toward the entrance of the ballroom where the doors had opened once again. Several guests turned curiously as a hotel attendant guided three children inside, accompanied by a foundation coordinator who had been helping them travel earlier that evening. Noah, Lily, and Ethan had arrived slightly later after finishing a youth reading event connected to the foundation's program earlier in the city. The children stepped into the ballroom with wide eyes, taking in the dazzling lights and towering ceilings with open curiosity. Emily's face brightened instantly when she saw them. Daniel followed her gaze and felt the ground shift beneath him once again. The three children looked around 6 or 7 years old, moving together with the easy familiarity of siblings. But what stopped Daniel cold was the unmistakable detail he saw when the oldest boy turned slightly beneath the chandelier light. The child's bright blue eyes looked strikingly familiar. Daniel Hayes could not look away from the three children as they walked further into the ballroom, their small footsteps soft against the polished marble floor while the golden chandelier light shimmered above them. The oldest boy moved first, curious but confident, his bright blue eyes scanning the room with the natural curiosity of a child seeing something new. Behind him, Lily held Ethan's hand, whispering something excitedly as they looked at the towering ceilings and elegant decorations. Emily's entire expression softened the moment she saw them. She stepped forward with a warmth Daniel had never seen before, the kind of quiet joy that only appeared when someone looked at the people who mattered most in their life. "Noah, Lily, Ethan," she said gently as they reached her side. "Did you enjoy the reading event tonight?" The children nodded eagerly. Lily spoke first, her voice bright and enthusiastic. "There were so many kids there, Mom. They loved the new books." Ethan added proudly, "I read a whole page by myself." Alexander knelt slightly so he could greet them at eye level. "I knew you could do it, Ethan," he said with an encouraging smile. Noah looked around the ballroom once more before turning toward Emily. "Mom, this place looks like a castle," he said quietly. Daniel stood frozen a few feet away, watching the scene unfold as if time had slowed around him. Something about the boy's face continued to pull at his memory. The shape of the eyes, the color, the subtle familiarity in the way the child tilted his head while observing the room. Daniel felt a strange pressure building in his chest as realization began to take shape in the back of his mind. Emily noticed his gaze and turned slightly toward him. "Daniel," she said calmly, "these are my children." Her voice carried quiet pride, but no tension. Noah, Lily, and Ethan looked toward Daniel with polite curiosity the way children do when meeting someone new. Noah offered a small wave. "Hello, sir." Daniel forced himself to respond, though his voice sounded distant even to his own ears. "Hello there." Alexander rested a gentle hand on Noah's shoulder. "This is Daniel Hayes," he explained evenly. Daniel studied the boy's face again, and this time the resemblance struck him with undeniable clarity. The same shade of blue eyes he had seen in his own reflection for most of his life. The same faint curve of the brow that once appeared in childhood photographs his mother kept in old albums. His mind rushed backward across the years to a hospital room in Chicago, to the moment Emily had signed the divorce papers without protest, to the quiet way she had placed her hand over her stomach just before he walked out the door. Daniel felt the breath leave his lungs as the pieces connected. He looked from Noah to Lily and then to Ethan, noticing subtle details he had missed before. The shape of their smiles, the familiar brightness in their expressions. Emily watched him silently, her calm composure revealing nothing except the quiet certainty of someone who had already made peace with the truth long ago. Daniel spoke slowly, almost carefully, as though the words themselves carried weight. "Emily, how old are they?" Emily answered simply, "They are 8 years old." The number echoed in Daniel's mind with startling clarity. 8 years since the night he had walked away. 8 years since the hospital room where he believed he had closed the door on that chapter of his life. Noah glanced up at Emily again with innocent curiosity. "Mom, who is he?" Emily rested a gentle hand on her son's shoulder, her eyes meeting Daniel's for a long, quiet moment before she answered softly. "Someone from a long time ago." The words lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Someone from a long time ago. Daniel Hayes felt the meaning settle heavily in his chest as he looked again at the three children standing beside Emily. 8 years old. The number repeated in his mind with quiet insistence, fitting too perfectly with the timeline he had tried to forget. Around them, the ballroom slowly returned to its rhythm, guests continuing their conversations, glasses clinking softly, the distant sound of piano keys drifting through the room. Yet for Daniel, the world felt narrowed to the small circle of people standing before him. Noah looked up at his mother again with the simple curiosity only children possess. "Was he one of your old friends, Mom?" Emily smiled gently, smoothing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Something like that," she said calmly. Lily tugged lightly on Emily's sleeve. "Mom, are we staying long?" The room is very fancy. Emily laughed softly. Just for a little while longer. Alexander watched the moment quietly, his expression composed yet observant. His hand rested lightly on Ethan's shoulder in a gesture that felt both protective and natural. Daniel noticed the ease with which the children leaned toward Alexander, the instinctive trust in their posture. It was clear they knew him as someone constant in their lives. Daniel cleared his throat slowly, struggling to steady his voice. "They are remarkable children," he said carefully. Emily nodded with quiet pride. "They are my greatest blessing." Daniel's gaze shifted again to Noah, then to Lily and Ethan. The resemblance was undeniable now that he allowed himself to see it. The color of their eyes, the small familiar expressions, pieces of himself reflected back in ways he had never expected to encounter. A realization began forming that carried both awe and a deep, uncomfortable weight. Emily had left that hospital room carrying far more than heartbreak. She had carried an entire future he never knew existed. For a moment Daniel seemed ready to ask the question pressing against his thoughts, the question that hovered unspoken between them. But Emily gently guided the children toward a nearby table where refreshments had been placed for families attending the event. "Go ahead and grab some juice," she told them. "Stay where I can see you." The children nodded and walked a few steps away, chatting quietly among themselves. Alexander watched them go before turning back toward Daniel and Emily. "I will check on the foundation coordinator for a moment," he said politely. Emily nodded with appreciation. "Thank you." As Alexander stepped away, Daniel found himself standing alone with the woman whose life had unfolded in ways he never imagined. The silence between them carried the weight of years. Finally Daniel spoke in a low voice. "You never told me." Emily met his gaze steadily. "You never asked." The honesty in her response was calm, but unshakable. Daniel looked down briefly, absorbing the truth in those words. When he looked back up, his expression had softened in a way that suggested the confidence he once carried so easily had shifted into something more reflective. "They deserve a good life," he said quietly, glancing toward the children again. Emily followed his gaze with a gentle smile. "They have one." Daniel hesitated before asking the question that had been building since the moment he saw Noah's eyes beneath the chandelier light. "Emily, are they mine?" Emily studied him for a moment before answering, her voice calm and certain. "They are my children, and they are deeply loved." Daniel stood there silently, realizing that the life he once walked away from had grown into something far stronger than anything he had ever planned. Daniel Hayes stood in the quiet space between the tables and the stage, feeling the weight of Emily's words settle deeper than anything he had expected to hear tonight. "They are my children, and they are deeply loved." The sentence carried a finality that did not need to be spoken twice. For a man who had spent most of his adult life controlling outcomes and negotiating advantages, the simplicity of her response left him with nothing to argue, nothing to challenge, and nothing to reclaim. Across the ballroom, the soft glow of chandeliers reflected across the polished floor while the event slowly resumed its lively rhythm. Investors were already discussing new partnerships, journalists were exchanging notes, and waiters moved quietly between guests offering refreshments. Yet for Daniel the night had changed completely. His eyes drifted again toward the children standing near the refreshment table. Noah was explaining something enthusiastically to Lily while Ethan carefully balanced a small glass of juice with both hands. Their laughter was light and effortless, untouched by the complicated realization that had just unfolded behind them. Emily watched them for a moment before turning back toward Daniel. There was no anger in her expression, only calm clarity that came from years of healing. "Life took us in different directions," she said gently. Daniel nodded slowly. "I see that now." His voice carried a quiet sincerity that surprised even him. For the first time in many years, he was not thinking about strategy or reputation or the next opportunity waiting around the corner. Instead, he was thinking about a hospital room in Chicago and the moment he had walked away from something he believed was weakness. He looked toward the children again, studying their faces with a new understanding. "They are remarkable," he said softly. Emily smiled faintly. "They are curious about everything. Books, oceans, insects in the garden. Sometimes I cannot keep up with their questions." Daniel gave a small, thoughtful nod. "It sounds like they have a good teacher." Emily glanced briefly toward the far side of the room, where Alexander was speaking with several guests. He has been an incredible part of their lives, she said. Daniel followed her gaze and watched Alexander read for a moment. The billionaire stood comfortably among influential figures, yet his attention kept drifting back toward the children as if ensuring they were always within sight. Daniel noticed the subtle gestures of familiarity. The way Ethan instinctively reached for Alexander's hand earlier. The way Noah listened to him with quiet respect. It was clear that the children did not see Alexander as a visitor. They saw him as someone constant. Daniel felt an unexpected sense of humility settle in his thoughts. You built something extraordinary, he admitted. Emily did not respond immediately. Instead, she watched Noah carefully wipe a drop of juice from Ethan's sleeve while Lily laughed beside them. Finally, she spoke in a quiet voice that carried both gratitude and quiet strength. I built a life that is peaceful. That was always enough. The music in the ballroom shifted to a slower melody as the evening continued. Guests began moving toward the dance floor, while others gathered in small groups to discuss the foundation's new initiatives. Emily stepped forward slightly. I should go check on them, she said gently. Daniel nodded, understanding that the conversation had reached its natural end. As Emily walked toward the children, Daniel remained where he stood, watching the small family gather together with Alexander returning to their side. For the first time in many years, Daniel Hayes realized something simple and undeniable. The life he once dismissed had not disappeared. It had quietly grown into something stronger than anything he had ever planned. Emily walked toward the children with the calm grace that had become second nature to her over the years. Noah looked up immediately when he saw her approaching, his blue eyes bright with curiosity. Mom, are we staying for the whole event? He asked while Lily carefully placed her empty glass back on the table and Ethan wiped his hands with a napkin. Emily smiled warmly. Not too much longer. I know this place feels very fancy after a long day. Ethan looked around the ballroom again with wide wonder. The lights look like stars, he said quietly while pointing toward the massive chandelier, hanging from the ceiling nearly 30 feet above them. Alexander joined them a moment later, resting his hand gently on Noah's shoulder. Did everyone survive their first big gala? He asked with a playful tone. Lily nodded enthusiastically. It is like a castle, she said. But castles usually have dragons. Alexander laughed softly. Fortunately, this one only has investors and journalists. Emily glanced across the ballroom for a brief moment and noticed Daniel still standing near the far side of the room, quietly observing the scene from a distance. There was no hostility in his posture anymore, only reflection. She turned her attention back to the children. Thank you for coming tonight, she said. The reading event earlier meant a lot to the younger students. Noah nodded proudly. The kids there were excited when we gave them the new books. Ethan added quietly, I liked the one about the ocean explorers. Alexander crouched slightly so he could speak to them at eye level. That is exactly why we started this program, he said. Every new book can open a new door. Emily watched the children listening to him with admiration and trust, and a quiet gratitude settled inside her heart. For many years, she had worried about how the past might shape their future, but the life they had built together proved that love and stability could grow even from difficult beginnings. Across the room, Daniel Hayes slowly walked toward the large windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The city lights stretched endlessly into the distance like a field of stars scattered across the dark horizon. He stood there for several moments reflecting on the path that had brought him to this exact night. 10 years ago, he had believed success meant moving faster, choosing ambition over patience, leaving behind anything that slowed his climb. Tonight, he understood something he had never calculated before. Some of the most important things in life grow quietly when no one is watching. Daniel glanced once more across the ballroom toward Emily and the children gathered around Alexander. They looked like a family that had been built with care rather than convenience. There was laughter, warmth, and an unmistakable sense of belonging between them. For the first time since seeing Emily again that evening, Daniel allowed himself a small, thoughtful smile. Not a smile of regret alone, but one of recognition. The future he once dismissed had become something meaningful. And perhaps that was exactly the kind of ending Emily Carter had quietly earned. The evening in Manhattan slowly began to settle into its final hours as the last speeches ended and guests moved more freely across the ballroom floor. The towering chandeliers still cast their warm golden glow across the marble floor while the distant sound of piano music drifted through the elegant hall. Emily Carter Reed stood beside Alexander and the children near the tall windows overlooking the city skyline. From this height, the lights of New York stretched for miles in every direction, shimmering like constellations scattered across the dark night. Noah pressed his hands lightly against the glass. "Mom, the whole city looks awake," he said with quiet amazement. Emily smiled and rested a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Cities like this never really sleep," she replied softly. Lily leaned against Alexander's arm while Ethan tried to count the yellow taxis moving below on the streets. Alexander looked down at the three children and then at Emily. "Are you ready to head back to the hotel soon?" he asked. "It has been a long day for explorers and readers." Emily nodded with a grateful smile. "I think we all earned some rest tonight." As the family gathered their coats, Daniel Hayes watched from across the room one final time. The distance between them felt symbolic now, not uncomfortable, but meaningful. He saw Emily kneel slightly to help Ethan adjust his small jacket, saw Noah explaining something excitedly to Lily, and saw Alexander place a steady, reassuring hand on Emily's back as they prepared to leave. It was a quiet portrait of something Daniel had once underestimated. A life built slowly, carefully, and with patience he never gave it the chance to show. Daniel stepped away from the window and walked calmly toward the exit on the opposite side of the ballroom. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final argument waiting to be spoken. The story between him and Emily had already reached its ending years ago, long before this evening brought them back into the same room. As he passed the entrance hall, he paused briefly and looked back one last time. Emily and the children were walking toward the elevators with Alexander beside them, their voices blending into soft laughter that echoed faintly through the marble corridor. Daniel allowed himself a quiet breath, and then continued toward the doors leading out to the cool Manhattan night. Outside, the air carried the crisp energy of the city, taxis moving steadily along the avenue while towering buildings glowed above the streets. Daniel adjusted his coat and walked down the steps into the rhythm of the city that had shaped his ambitions for so long. For the first time in many years, his thoughts were not focused on the next deal or the next success waiting around the corner. Instead, he was thinking about a hospital room long ago and the quiet strength of a woman he once misunderstood. High above the street in the elevator, Noah tugged gently on Emily's hand. "Mom, that man earlier looked familiar somehow," he said thoughtfully. Emily looked down at him with calm warmth. "Some people appear in our lives for only a short time," she said. "What matters most is the life we build after they are gone." The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and the family stepped out together, their laughter returning easily. As they walked down the quiet hotel hallway, far below, the city continued its endless movement, but Emily Carter Reed had already found something far more valuable than ambition or recognition. She had found peace. And sometimes peace was the most powerful victory of all.